Welcome everyone for IP Council's webinar with the title Solution Research of a Problem, Licensing Negotiation Groups in the Internet of Things. My name is Claudia Tapia, President of 4IP Council, and I will be your host today. As you may know, 4IP Council is a non-for-profit research organization focused on the link between IP and innovation. We identify the most relevant topics, offer empirical research, and we do so by working closely with a wide variety of academics, experts, IP organizations, and other stakeholders. On our website, you can find a range of free materials, studies, guidelines, summaries of relevant papers, and recordings of different webinars, like the one today. Moreover, we produce easy to digest content, specially tailored to non-IP experts, SMEs, and startups. This is free of charge too. Some examples are interactive graphics and interviews to inspire them. And with this, we aim to assist innovative startups and SMEs to learn how to use IP in order to grow the businesses. We have also created a case law area with summaries of court cases related to patent essential 2 standards, some of which we have translated into Japanese and Chinese for you to download free of charge. And the reason for doing this exercise is that standards are getting increasingly important. As you know, more and more things are getting connected via the Internet of Things, but to achieve this, standardized technologies are required. And these cutting-edge standardized technologies are often protected by patents, which are typically available on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms and conditions, the so-called FRAND terms. So FRAND terms are usually agreed in bilateral licensing negotiations, where 2 parties, the SEP holder, those owning those standard essential patents, and those using the standardized technologies known as SEP users, are doing in good faith negotiation. But as more and more sectors are incorporating wireless technologies, which are standardized, for example, 4G and 5G, to enhance their products or services, they are also infringing SEPs. So they require the so-called FRAND licenses. And this has led to the European Commission raising concerns regarding the lack of experience of some stakeholders in what is these FRAND licensing negotiations. And the focus relies in transparency. What I mean is that the idea behind of those concerns is that by having non-experts on FRAND, such as many small and medium enterprises, they will have better situation if they could understand what FRAND terms are, if there will be a place where they could look at this information, also which patents from all patents that are potentially essential are at the end essential. So transparency is key. And one of the initiatives that the European Commission launched was the creation of an SEP expert group, which mission, I quote here, was to deepen the expertise on evolving industry practices related to the licensing of ICPs in the context of digitalization of the economy, the sound valuation of IP, and the determination of FRAND licensing terms. Wow. So at the end, this group engaged in deep discussions, and they published last year a compilation of individual proposals. One of them was the so-called Licensing Negotiation Group, or LNG. And you may recall we organized a webinar to discuss this proposal with several experts, Igor Nikolic and Haris Tisilikas, from the antitrust perspective. We also published a paper of Igor Nikolic, which is in our website on the same topic. But today we will discuss the proposal from an economic angle. And we're very lucky to count with one of the members of the SAP expert group, as well as another excellent speaker with quite impressive CV. So Professor Jonathan Barnett, he's a professor at the University of Southern California School of Law and director of the Law's Media, Entertainment and Technology Law program. Dr. Justus Aberam is a senior research associate at the Center on Law, Business and Economics at the Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. Now, a final remark for the audience. Please do not hesitate to use the Q&A tool to submit your live questions. And thanks to those who have submitted them also previously prior to this webinar. You can find the Q&A tool in the lower part of your screen. You can raise your questions anytime during and after the presentations. The questions will be addressed following the presentation. So Justus, first of all, congrats for being elected as one of the members of the SAP expert group. As I assume it has not been an easy task considering the complexity of the front topic. I was wondering, before we start with Jonathan's presentation, whether you could explain us a bit, what is the LNG proposal about?
Yeah, thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you very much to the 4IP Council and the organizers of this webinar for having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak a little bit about the policy context as far as I understand it and am aware of it, and offer some additional remarks after Jonathan's presentation of his paper. So with respect to your question and the SAP expert group, you're right, I was very honored and fortunate to have been one of the members of this expert group, and we have deliberated and exchanged ideas for about 2 years before publishing our contribution to the debate. As you already pointed out, it's important to understand that this contribution to the debate, which is aptly named, and it's not intended to be a list of recommendations emerging from the consensus of the group, but rather is a list of individual experts' proposals that have been discussed to the extent that, and at the discretion of the expert who has made a proposal, other experts' comments are also included in the text of the proposal. And otherwise, some of these proposals are accompanied by concerns that other experts have raised. So one of the other caveats or things to keep in mind is that the explicit mandate of the Commission was to propose a very wide and open set of ideas, and not to hesitate to propose ideas that would need to undergo further scrutiny and further debate after the publication of the report. So it's not the job of the expert group to collect scientific evidence regarding the existence of a problem or the viability of a solution. It was our role to stimulate the debate by proposing potentially innovative ideas. That being said, one of the ideas included in the report of the expert group is this proposal 75, which explicitly mentions the concept or the mechanism of a licensee negotiation group. And I think that what's clear is from the text of the proposal is that it's primarily addressed at competition authorities in respect to its policy implications, and it's explicitly aimed at reducing the risk that such licensee negotiation groups might get into conflict with existing antitrust regulations. So to see where that fits in the broader policy debate, as you know, there is a very large number of policy proposals being floated and considered and debated right now. And there's a lot of different policymakers who are taking different initiatives in that field right now. So I think for this particular proposal, it seems primarily directed at the competition authorities, and one natural place would be for such a proposal to be implemented by it being potentially included, for example, in updated guidance in the horizontal guidelines on forms of collaboration between competitors that would usually not violate EU competition law. So while this is clearly a very important policy instrument in the EU, these horizontal guidelines, it's also important to understand that this is a little bit separate from an endorsement of licensee negotiation groups as a form of licensing. Stating that licensee negotiation groups should not be considered, or that policymakers are invited to clarify the circumstances under which licensee negotiation groups would not be in conflict with EU competition law, is different from saying that the policymaker endorses this as the one and only and the preferred method of licensing. It's also to be separated from the question to what extent an implementer's position that he seeks to license exclusively through a licensee negotiation group would be compatible with the conduct of a willing licensee. And while there are, it's difficult to imagine circumstances in which a licensee negotiation group that would be considered anti-competitive under EU competition law would be compatible with the conduct of a willing licensee. I think it's possible to imagine circumstances in which a licensee negotiation group that does not constitute a competition law violation in itself nevertheless is not compatible with the conduct of a willing licensee. So I think that the binding edge, like the really policy relevant margin is more on the side where the courts consider, depending on the individual facts of the case, that the conduct of the licensee is compatible with the conduct of a willing licensee. So in that context, this ongoing debate at the competition policy level is clearly relevant, but it's not the only policy relevant debate surrounding these licensing negotiation groups. But with this being said, it is obviously the case that the proposal has already generated interest and strong reactions from industry participants, from academics, from commentators, which is clearly in line with what the Commission has given us as expert group as a mandate. So we, as I already said, our job was to stimulate debate by making provocative suggestions. But then obviously it's very important that before these provocative suggestions are translated into policy actions, they are submitted to rigorous scrutiny, in particular regarding the evidentiary base supporting the proposal. And that obviously is what Jonathan has set out to do in his paper. And with all this being said, I think it's now the time to give the floor to Jonathan so that he can offer us his thoughts on the evidence regarding this specific policy proposal.
Thank you, Justus. And Jonathan, thanks a lot for agreeing to join this panel. And I would like also to congratulate you for your book, Innovators, Forms and Markets, which I think was last year. And for those who do not know it yet, personally found it a very interesting reading, and I strongly recommend it. So you're still on time to go for that book. But now back to the LNG topic. We are looking forward to hearing your insights, first understanding what LNG proposal is about and what is your opinion on it. And with that, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you, Eustas, for your insightful remarks. I'm excited to present my ideas and analysis to you today. I'm part of a community of researchers, including Eustas, of course, who we have been working closely in analyzing virtually every aspect of SEP licensing, litigation, and transactional markets. And it's exciting to have an opportunity like this where we can leverage the existing research, which is both theoretical and empirical, and see whether that analysis changes as the wireless market changes. And what's exciting right now is that we don't have to talk about phones all the time anymore. Wireless is moving from being a wireless specific technology, which is in and of itself huge, right, into being a general enabling technology, starting with automotive mobility, moving into healthcare, and moving into many markets that are difficult to imagine. Given the breadth of those markets, given the dollar values and economic values at stake, it's very important that we take policy actions that are grounded in sound economics and are grounded in fact, as distinguished from rhetoric and anecdote. And that's what this paper tries to do. And I'm going to
sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure we cannot see the slides. At least I cannot see them. Wanted to make sure that you took control.
Okay.
Of this. So now I see the solution in search of a problem. Maybe you can continue moving them. And the next one. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. The agenda of my presentation will be as you see here. It's essentially I'll be working through this in two parts and answering two questions. The first is the LNG proposal purports to address a certain type of problem. And in competition policy, the problems we care about are market failures, deviations from efficient markets. So the first question we have to ask is, in SEP licensing, do we have any sound reason as a matter of theory of empirics to think that there is a market failure or there's likely to be a market failure? And the second question we ask is, given our assessment of the likelihood of market failure or the existence or non-existence of market failure, is the LNG the best solution, right? And what do I mean by best solution? I mean the solution that's likely to do the best job at making markets more competitive than they are right now. Okay. So let's start with the problem. The problem is very well known, and it's been part of, I would say, conventional wisdom in much of the regulatory policy writing, scholarly writing since the mid-2000s. And it relies on a very simple view, a very simple model. The model is a model that all economists are familiar with. It's the monopoly pricing model. And all that we do is we take the monopoly pricing model and we call the monopolist an SEP owner. So we're going to assume that every single SEP owner is a monopolist. And a monopolist, by definition, can set the royalty rate at whatever they want. And that rate's going to be the rate that maximizes their expected revenues. Well, this creates two problems theoretically, according to this model. The first problem has come to be known as patent holdup. Patent holdup assumes our SEP licensor, again, is a monopolist, and they hold an input that the implementer has to have in order to produce the particular market. As a result, the implementers are purportedly locked into that technology. The SEP owners can set whatever royalty rate they want. If that's true, they're going to set the royalty rate so that they capture all the surplus value in the market, and they leave just enough so that the implementer has enough to pay for lunch, dinner, and rent. What we're going to see is this is totally not true, and that the implementers are left with money on the table that they can pay for lunch, dinner, and rent, not just for themselves, but for entire countries. The second problem is that is well known ever since Cournot in the late 19th century, that if you have monopoly component suppliers, monopoly input suppliers, and you also assume that they cannot signal or communicate with one another in any way, they're each going to set the individually rational profit maximizing price. And transplanted to the SEP context, we get what's become known as the royalty stack, where each SCP monopolist sets a royalty, one sitting on top of the other. And if that's true, our phones are going to be very expensive. And the only people who are going to have phones are going to be Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk, because it's too expensive for everyone else. Last time I checked, that's not true. Now, as we move from 3G to 4G to 5G into the Internet of Things, things get very interesting, because now wireless is not just connecting people, what I call C2C, or we could have said P2P, not only connecting businesses to people, but business to machines, people to machines, and machines to machines. And the relationships multiply exponentially. Now, it's entirely plausible to express concern that as these relationships multiply, the IP licensing transaction costs are going to get so huge that they're going to swamp the gains, no one's going to license, and the Internet of Things is going to stall. It's not going to develop. This is an application of another idea that is very common in the IP and innovation scholarship, known as a patent thicket, where you have too many patents and they're held by many dispersed owners. The licensing costs swallow up economic gains, the transactions don't move forward, and instead of having cars, we're still riding around on horse and buggies. That's also not true. Now, if this is true, if there is a patent thicket, it might be the case that we can improve market competitiveness by deviating from the rule that generally we do not allow buyers to act collectively. We make an exception and we allow the SCP licensees to do so and to negotiate the rates collectively with the licensors. This might produce two things that are good from competition policy perspective. One, we have one-stop shopping, so we collapse thousands of licensing relationships into one, so we reduce the transaction costs. And the second is that the licensees as a group will be able to push down the royalty rates. I'll come back to the second one. The second one is not in and of itself a good thing from a competition policy perspective if we understand that dynamically over multiple, if we don't just look at the economy right now. I'll get back to that point. All right, now let's ask, those two problems, patent holdup and royalty stacking, I'm going to come back to patent thicket. Are these truly problems? As a matter of theory, is it plausible? Yes, it is plausible. As a matter of fact, is it true? Well, in the social sciences, we can never be entirely correct of anything. We have multiple explanations for what we observed in reality, and we will always choose the explanation that does the best job of observing what we see. So let's imagine we have two hypotheses. One, I've already described to you, that there's going to be market failure due to patent holdup and royalty stacking. Let's test that hypothesis. It is testable because it has a very simple prediction. If those theories were true, the phones would be very expensive, the markets wouldn't grow, there wouldn't be a lot of R&D because I'm not going to do R&D in a market where I can only sell to 3 people, and the prices will always be increasing because of the royalty stack. If you just think about your everyday experience over the past 5 to 10 years owning a feature phone and then a cell phone, you know that's not true. In fact, I'll tell you how untrue it is. There has never been a technology in recorded history that has been adopted as fast as the cellular and the smartphone. Now, what does that suggest? It suggests that the prices can't be increasing, because why would adoption continuously increase? It suggests that the market is expanding, because otherwise, why would companies continue innovating for a market. And in fact, not only are the prices not increasing, if you adjust for quality, because you know your phone can do a lot more things than it could do 10 years ago, the prices are actually declining. That's just not consistent with patent holdup. It's just not consistent with royalty stacking. As plausible as they may seem theoretically, they just aren't supported by the facts. Now, more micro studies that try and estimate the aggregate royalty rates, which we can never do with absolute certainty, but we can take comfort that multiple studies using different methodologies, slightly different data sources, they all reach an estimate of between 3.5% to 5.5% of the average device price going up to the SCP owners. And those rates are constant over time. Again, a complete discrepancy with patent holdup, because if the implementers are locked into the standard, wouldn't the SCP owners take advantage of that to increase rates as they become more locked in? But we don't see that at all. Now, when facts don't match theory, what we also do in the social sciences is we go back to theory, we go back to the blackboard and see something must have been wrong in our model because it doesn't seem to be right. There's actually two things that were wrong in the model that many regulators and most scholars initially adopted. So using simple terms from game theory, the original model relied on a single period game. You're only playing a game once, and the SCP licensor has all the cards in his hand, all the good ones. So of course, the SCP licensor is going to use that leverage to capture all the value in the market. But that's not how wireless markets work if you take the time to study them. We haven't just had 2G and just stopped. We had 2G, we had 3G, 3.5G, 4G, and lots of flavors in between. And we have SCP licensors staying in the game. It's not a one-period game, it's a multi-period game, and you want to maximize your returns over all the periods. Not only that, when you are monetizing your research in 3G, you are taking those royalty revenues and you are plowing them back to develop 4G. Now, if you were to conform to the patent holdup model as you're expected to, you're not going to do very well as a repeat player, because guess what's going to happen when you try and get your technology adopted in 4G and 5G? You're not going to find a lot of customers. The other error that's made, and again, these errors are made because they were developed under models that don't look at how the markets actually work. If you look at actual negotiating dynamics between licensors and licensees, the licensor does not have all the good cards. In fact, you might argue the licensee does. How is that possible? This is why it's possible. Let's take our average big licensor. They have incurred several billions of dollars of R&D costs on their systems technology. They have not earned a dollar on that until a small handful of large handset manufacturers adopt it. During that period, since injunctions are hard to obtain, the licensee can use that technology throughout the negotiation and litigation process. They are earning money on technology they never developed. The licensor must license the technology in order to monetize its R&D, putting it in a disadvantageous bargaining position in negotiating with licensees, which might explain why they take a surprisingly small percentage of the money on the table in the market. All right. Now, at this point, I might tell you that we can now just go for lunch or dinner or breakfast, depending on what time zone you're in, because there really doesn't seem to be much of a problem here. But I'm going to give every benefit of the doubt to those who think that LNGs are a good solution. And there is one market failure that is plausible to entertain, which is the patent thicket problem. And the reason I say it's plausible to entertain is because it is true that the 5G IoT environment might have higher transaction cost issues because of the number of licensing opportunities and relationships. For the moment, I'm going to assume that that could be an issue. I'll come back to whether we really think that could be an issue. If it is an issue, we could imagine endorsing some latitude for collective purchasing groups. We have to be cautious, in fact, extremely cautious, because competition policy is always extremely cautious about deviating from the rule that typically we have a bright line rule against any form of cooperation among sellers or buyers. Now, why can a buyer group, why do we have such a strict rule against a buyer cooperation? Well, there's two reasons. The first is that when the buyers coordinate, they can push the prices paid to the suppliers. Let's imagine we have retailers who negotiate with suppliers. They can push that below the competitive level. What are the suppliers going to do? They're going to reduce output. What you've now done is that you've pushed the market away from the competitive equilibrium. In innovation markets, this is actually especially concerning because the output is in the form of R&D. And it is widely recognized that the economic value that you get over time from R&D dollars are going to be far greater than the value that you could get by any incremental reduction in prices of existing goods. The second problem is that if the retailers in my hypothetical also have market power, what will happen is that even if they push down the prices paid to suppliers, consumers will not see a cent of that. They're just going to keep that in their pocket. And they're now in a position to coordinate on prices offered to consumers since they've already coordinated on at least some of the inputs. Now, there is one circumstance in which antitrust theory recognizes that collective buying could be good at the end of the day from a competition perspective. And that would be a case where collective buying groups reduce the transaction costs of the negotiation and related transactions, and they do not have market power so that they are in a position to pass on those savings to consumers. I will point out that these buying group exceptions have generally been recognized in physical goods markets where you're most likely to get economies of scale by bringing together lots of smaller firms. Okay, that's obviously not relevant in intangible goods that we're talking about. All right. Now, the arguments for LNGs are more specific. The first is to protect from holdup and stacking. Based on about 3 decades of market performance in the wireless markets, we would have to say that the likelihood of this market failure materializing is very low. The second argument is the patent thicket argument, which I've mentioned, which is more plausible because you do have something potentially new in the 5G market where you may have more and less concentrated licensees in certain market segments than you have had in the wireless markets where 3G, 4G have been licensed. Okay. So the only reason we would think that there would be a new problem in wireless licensing as we move into the IoT is we have to identify characteristics that are unique to the IoT and uniquely raise market failures that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. This question cannot be answered definitively since we are at the incipiency of these markets. The best we can do is to look at preliminary licensing activity in 3 markets where in 2 markets where it's occurred, and 3 markets where it has really not yet occurred, but there's been frequent concerns expressed, so I will address them. Let's start with the first 2, wireless and automotive. We've already had significant amount of deal-making activity in the wireless device markets. The structure of these licensing activities, the composition of the licensors and licensees are not very different from what we've seen in 3G, 4G, and so we have to say that does not seem to be anything new about 5G licensing into the wireless telecom market, and therefore there is no apparent problem at the moment for which a solution is required. Thank you very much. The second is in the automotive market. That is a new market, but guess what? although we do not have as much licensing activity, we have some transactions to look at. And these transactions that we do have are starting to mimic the structure that we've already seen in the wireless markets and have worked well in the wireless telecom markets. Additionally, the licensee-licensor pool is similar structurally to the wireless telecom market in the sense that it is a relatively small numbers environment. What do I mean by that? Small numbers on the licensor-licensee side. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because that means that the patent thicket problem is unlikely to arise here because we don't have exponentially greater licensing transactions than we would have in the wireless market. And this is being facilitated by the tendency we've observed in licensing transactions so far, which is to mimic the OEM level licensing structure that has worked well in the wireless market that reduces transaction costs by funneling your licensing at one point on the supply chain. So again, in the automotive, we have no reason based on 3 decades of licensing that the licensors would have newly awakened incentives to engage in patent holdup and stacking that they haven't engaged in before. And we're again in a small numbers environment. And so the patent thicket problem doesn't seem to be incrementally greater than it would have been in the wireless market, and it has not been great in that market. So what's left? What's left is the SMEs licensing market, which cuts across market segments. It's defined by an entity type, not an industry type. And here the greatest concerns have been raised. It's very important, however, to distinguish between concerns about licensing in automotive and in SMEs. Those I have personally seen being conflated in some of the commentary, and for the reasons I just mentioned, you are going to reach incorrect economic results, competition policy results, if you conflate those markets. Why do I emphasize this point? Because the SME licensing markets, which again, I have to also stress, are mostly hypothetical, right? It is not as if the SME licensing problems that are being talked about have yet materialized. I have not found formal empirical documentation of these issues. However, they may pose a large number environment that could give rise to patent thicket. Now, again, there's not much that we can say about these markets at the moment because they have not yet developed sufficiently that we can make informed judgments as a matter of policy. However, it is important to keep in mind that there is an empirical literature that has studied patent thicket claims in past markets. We can learn from history. We can learn from other large number environments. Patent thicket claims are widespread in the literature. However, as I and other empirical researchers have tried to show in the past decade or so, very few of these claims have ever been subjected to close empirical scrutiny. When they have, in every single episode without exception, researchers have failed to find the patent thicket. What do they instead find? They instead find that markets innovate. Not innovate in terms of inventors, but innovation by lawyers, innovation by bankers, innovation through contract. Markets see a thicket on the horizon. They don't like thickets because it doesn't allow them to realize value. They take action to mitigate it. What I'm going to do in the very last part of my talk is I'm going to be extremely conservative empirically, and I'm going to assume that there may be a problem, contrary to history, of a patent thicket in the SME licensing markets. Under that hypothetical assumption, which is factually not well supported historically, would it still be the case that LNGs are a good idea? And the answer is no. The reason the answer is no is because in competition policy, even if we identify an actual or likely market failure, even if we identify a regulatory intervention that could correct it, we must ask as a final question, is there any other intervention or any other mechanism that could correct this market failure, mitigate this market failure at a lower cost? If so, we're going to, of course, go for the least cost alternative. The LNG, even under the most favorable empirical assumptions, does not pass the least cost test. And the reason is that there is another mechanism available in the market to mitigate patent thickets, and that is a patent pool administered by an independent administrative entity. Why is this superior? Well, the simple answer, it's superior because it reduces transaction costs through a one-stop shopping mechanism without having horizontal cooperation amongst buyers, which we prohibit in competition policy in most circumstances for the reasons I mentioned. So you can achieve one-stop shopping at a low risk of competitive harm. Moreover, this mechanism is not hypothetical like the LNG. It actually exists. Since the late 1990s, at least in the US markets, there has been a proliferation of patent pools in all manner of consumer electronics markets. These work well, and based on my own research focused on the MPEG family of patent pools, they impose nominal additional costs on the price paid by the retail user. Now you might ask, couldn't the patent pool also be used as a disguised form of horizontal cooperation by the licensors? Well, the very first MPEG LA pool that was set up and was blessed by the US regulators established a structure to achieve a very attractive balance between reducing transaction costs and minimizing any opportunity for collusion. The number one reason that the risk for collusion is so low here is that everything is in the hands of the administrator. The administrator has no economic stake in the downstream market. The administrator can't charge exorbitant rates because otherwise they won't be able to get licensees on board or licensors on board. Moreover, the administrator is a repeat player. So even if you could concoct a scenario in which they colluded with the licensors in one pool, that would defeat the purpose, that would prevent them from maximizing revenues over many pools. And all of the major administrators we see, they constantly are forming new pools. Lastly, many of the licensors are actually, based on my research, they are net licensees, so they have no interest in increasing the rates. And that's what we've observed repeatedly in the patent pools. This patent pool mechanism is not even hypothetical in the wireless market. It already exists. The MSE Licensing platform is successful in 3G, 4G licensing, and they've also achieved something that the MPEG and some of the other existing pools have never been able to achieve. They've secured participation by the high-value SEP licensors in the automotive SEP licensing market. They've been able to do that by having a value base rather than a strictly numerically based royalty formula. So is there a problem that requires a solution in wireless SEP licensing as it moves into 5G IoT? Probably not, based on 3 decades of market performance and empirical study. Is there anything different in the 5G IoT market that might suggest perhaps transaction costs will be higher? Yes, there are in specific market segments, namely the SMEs, about which we know very little. However, even assuming that transaction costs were higher in the SME markets as they develop, there already exists market-based mechanisms for rectifying any such failure ahead of time, in which case the LNG proposal again, does not pass a cost-benefit test or is unlikely to pass a cost-benefit test as a matter of competition policy. Thank you very much, and I very much welcome your questions.
Many thanks, Jonathan. It's 4:45, so I'm thinking, Justus, will you maybe like to give a quick response or maybe sharing of thoughts on the presentation so that we can move right after to the Q&A?
Absolutely. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for a very clear presentation. I have prepared a couple of thoughts that I'd like to share. Maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to reduce the list a little bit. But the first idea that I think is really important and that you have insisted on quite a lot is the evidence base for a policy proposal. So I think that the proposal of licensee negotiation groups is not unique in that it shares a fundamental characteristic with many other proposals that are being made right now, in that it is born out of an apparent dissatisfaction with the current state of SEP licensing and a mistrust in bilateral negotiations as a mechanism for determining licensing terms. And this, at least in the view of European Commission and many other policymakers or some other policymakers, is accused of creating excessive litigation, a lack of transparency, and with ultimately two outcomes. The first is transaction costs or loss to society at large. And second, a balance of negotiation power that unfairly favors SEP holders. So as you have pointed out, the evidence base for these claims is disputed, to say the least. And the one takeaway from that is that, is there a problem in the sense of, does the market not work? Like, is the market so broken that the industry or these products are prevented from thriving? And I think there's consensus that this is not the case. So the question can only be a hypothetical counterfactual question, in the sense is there a problem such that if we removed that problem, we would replace a great system by an even greater system? And obviously the bar for the evidence that you need to produce in order to address these counterfactual questions, that's extremely difficult, and you quickly run into this nirvana fallacy, where you compare existing observable institutions and behaviors with an idealized hypothetical situation based on theory. And I think that the licensee negotiation group is a little bit an example of that. And another thing that is really relevant from that is that there is this coexistence of two competing claims. On the one hand, there is harm to all industry participants. So there's a hope that policy intervention might benefit participants on both sides of the market, with this claim that there is an unfair balance of bargaining powers unfairly favoring SEP holders. And with respect to the licensee negotiation groups, that kind of leads to a little bit of a broken analogy with this patent pool situation. Many people approaching the licensee negotiation group have this first reaction to say, okay, we allow SEP holders to coordinate on licensing rates. We generally think that this is often pro-competitive in the SEP space. Why don't we apply that reasoning to the implementer side? Well, one thing that has become very clear from the debate about SEP pools is that there's a clear line to be drawn between anti-competitive and pro-competitive pools. And that clear line is that anti-competitive pools are those that are used by SEP holders to improve the bargaining power, or by patent holders at large, to improve the bargaining power of patent holders in their negotiations with implementers. Simply raise prices, for example, by reducing competition between patents. Pro-competitive pools are those that are either born out of a desire to reduce transaction costs or to coordinate on rates in view of lowering the rates that can be offered to the implementers. So if you really think that licensee negotiation groups are a mirror to patent pools, then you should be expecting that licensee negotiation groups would be an instrument convincing implementers of raising the licensing rates that they are prepared to pay to SEP holders. And I don't think that the current proponents of the licensing negotiation group view that tool or view that instrument in that light. So it's, if there's any kind of analogy between licensing negotiation groups and patent pools, it would be the analogy with the former type of patent pools that are now considered anti-competitive, which are a tool of improving the bargaining position of the ones participating in this coordination. And then the third aspect, which I think is really important, is that this idea of licensing negotiation group currently seems a little bit underdeveloped in the sense that it's not exactly clear what exactly is being proposed. And there are at least two big scenarios that I can imagine, and each of these has different ramifications. And I think that it's really difficult to analyze the viability of these proposals without making these distinctions. So the I know that I'm running short of time, but like it's maybe 2 minutes. So the first scenario is that licensing negotiation groups are an instrument for implementers to engage with an SEP holder that has approached them and that is attempting to license its SEPs with them. So it's basically for them to coordinate their response to a licensing offer from an SEP holder. And in that there's this question, okay, there's a situation in which there are so dramatic transparency gains and transaction cost reductions that the SEP holder actually likes that. And then I think there's no policy ground to oppose that everybody is fine with conducting negotiations through this coordinated effort. So there's no reason for competition policy or other kind of policy instruments to stand in the way. But more likely there is a dissonance of views where the patent holder would prefer bilateral negotiation and the implementer would prefer a joint negotiation effort involving implementers. And then the question is, who gets to choose? And I think that once again, like it's there are multiple scenarios, but the scenarios that implementers seem to have in mind is that the implementer can flatly refuse an individual approach from an SEP holder, say, I only want to engage with you through that negotiation group. And I think that this is difficult to reconcile with the existing jurisprudence, for example, in the German system, where you have this idea that a willing licensee is one that is willing to take any licensing offer that is friend. So you cannot outright condition your willingness on the fact that you're being offered a licensing offer through that negotiation group. But there is a situation in which licensing negotiation groups could be viable, and that is if you have indicated your willingness. And then after that indication, the SEP holder has failed to make your friend licensing offer, then it is incumbent upon the implementer to respond with a counter offer. And if there are multiple implementers in that situation that have not been able to secure a friend licensing offer, then and who are in the situation of and accept to be in the situation of being in the obligation to make a licensing offer, then it might be a viable solution for them to make such a licensing offer through a coordinated effort. But this is very different from a position where you just flatly refuse to engage with bilateral negotiations on the ground that you prefer to negotiate through a licensing negotiation group. And I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna stop here, even though I had other points, but I want to leave time for the Q&A.
I know it's challenging, right? We could speak about this topic like the whole day. There are always so many things to say. And by the way, those who are interested in the slides, we will upload them. Jonathan was so kind to also put a reference with all the books and magazines that he has referred today, so that you can also spend some time doing that. And reading all this interesting material. But let's go into the first question, which is, if licensing negotiation groups can reduce royalties, isn't that always a good outcome as a matter of competition policy?
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. And the simple answer is no. From a competition policy perspective, what we want to do, not just in SEPs, but generally, what we want to do is to make sure that market actors are operating in an environment in which assets can be priced accurately. And that's why antitrust law competition law generally prohibits not just seller collusion, which increases prices relative to the competitive equilibrium, but buyer collusion, because it reduces prices, it causes sellers to restrict output, and it causes the market to shrink below the level that it would have been in competitive under competitive conditions. Now, as I mentioned before, the dangers, the economic costs associated with pushing input prices, in this case, the input is technology, pushing input prices below competitive levels, when the input is a technology, when the output is R&D, the economic costs are magnified relative to what I would call technologically weak or static markets. Okay? The economic costs with pushing the price of SEPs below competitive levels are far greater than the economic costs of pushing the price of apples below competitive levels. And let me give you an example for why that's the case, right? When smartphone technologies improve, you don't just get a better phone. You get Uber, you get Airbnb, you get remote healthcare. There's a market multiplier effect that is far greater than the effect, than the gains that you're going to get by the existing smartphone technology being priced a few cents lower. And we also should be concerned that even in cases where royalty rates are reduced, those gains may be pocketed by the manufacturer if it occupies a bottleneck position on the consumer pathway. There is no assurance that those costs will be passed on to the consumer. And so even if something like LNGs were to reduce royalty rates, what you could be doing in that case is simply transferring wealth from companies that produce innovation to companies that use innovation with no benefit for consumers. There is no known framework of competition policy that could possibly favor that outcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Justus, in terms of times, if it's okay, I'm going to raise the second question, which is if the evidence for Holdup and Unreality staking is so weak as presented, why do some regulators and scholars continue to rely on these theories? And have you seen any change within the last time regarding their view on this Holdup and Unreality staking?
Another great question. Yeah, so we see, I think we see different tendencies. I think we see some portions of the scholarly community have not yet integrated the empirical findings in a considered manner into their analysis. That analysis tends to remain at a theoretical level. Some regulators have had a similar response, but not all, right? And I think two examples where you see the empirical evidence being incorporated into actual policymaking are first, the increased sophistication with which the European, including, by which I mean I include the UK courts, address the issue of injunctive relief for SEPs, where they fully recognize in the courts now, since Huawei v. ZTE, that there's a risk of patent hold out in addition to patent hold up, and that has integrated the unwilling licensee concept into the case law and injunctions. And on that point, the European and the UK courts are a step ahead in sophistication and in nuance of U.S. case law. The second way in which the evidence has been integrated was the revised policy statement on SEPs that were issued under the previous administration in the United States by the Department of Justice, which took into account the evidence that had cast doubt on patent holdup. And so I think we have an ongoing conversation, but I think that there is room for both scholarship and for regulators to take into account some of the more recent empirical research.
Justus, maybe would you like to share some thoughts from the European side? How are you seeing this?
I think that the general Holdup, patent thicket, royalty stacking kind of lens has proven to be unproductive. I think that there's consensus that there won't be consensus. There's consensus that the empirical evidence isn't there to substantiate that these things are material, that these things are urgent to be addressed. What I think is the direction of empirical research and policy analysis is to be a little bit more granular, to look at these issues individually. And I think that for an issue such as licensee negotiation group, I think that that means that definitely it's something that shouldn't be based on such a broad theory of market failure. We need to correct the way that SEP licensing is going on. And I think that definitely the current proposal as it stands has that flavor. I think that when we move away from these very thick brushed descriptions of the current state of affairs, then there's room to analyze these individual proposals a little bit more carefully. I think that Jonathan makes a persuasive case that we are not there with the licensee negotiation groups, and that this is that the potential risks that go along with these proposals outweigh the benefits. But I think that in general, as an approach to these policy proposals, this is the direction of travel, and I think that this is a welcome development.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing your experience. I see in the chat we have one of the members of the SAP expert group also congratulating you for this great
Thank you. Thank you.
And feedback and sharing. So unfortunately we are out of time, and I would like to again thank you for attending this webinar to the audience too. And later on, you will be receiving an email inviting you to complete a 1-minute survey about this webinar, and we will be very thankful if to receive your feedback. And as explained before, a recording of this presentation, as well as these slides, will be made available for the Council's website tomorrow, the latest. So please don't forget to register to the upcoming webinar, Anti-suit and Anti-suit injunctions in SAP litigation with Dr. Igor Nikolic. And with that, I wish you all a great rest of the day, depending what time you are now, right now, in which zone, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.